Regina Winters is the Assistant Dean of the UCCS School of Public Affairs and a Senior Instructor in the Master of Public Administration program. She received her undergraduate degrees in Political Science and Music and an MPA from the University of Wyoming, and completed postgraduate coursework in Public Administration from the University of Nebraska at Omaha. She has served as a public administration instructor and lecturer at the University of Nebraska in Omaha and Iowa State University. She teaches courses in research methods, nonprofit management, public policy, and citizen participation. Ms. Winters pursued a career in public administration because public administration is uniquely eclectic. Currently, she's researching social impact program evaluation methods in the Rocky Mountain region and consults with area nonprofit organizations on board member development, strategic planning, and program evaluation. Please join me in welcoming Assistant Dean Winters to the stage.
Thank you so much for that lovely introduction. I want to thank AFP for inviting me to come speak to you about things that I'm so passionate about, and including ethics and also philanthropy and, of course, my students. And so with that, let me tell you a little bit about what I've been doing for the last couple of years. So this images are so important. And this image I ran into when I was 18 years old at the University of Wyoming, trying to figure out what I wanted to do with my life, trying to figure out what I wanted to major in, etc. And it was from one of my nonprofit management textbooks. And I grabbed onto this image because then I could major in something that was going to be cool, because everybody loves nonprofits. No one doesn't love them. They're awesome things. Their missions are always for good, so I didn't have to worry about that. People give people money just because there's lots of money available, so that was a great thing too. And I had met a couple of people in my service learning, in my volunteer life. I grew up here in Colorado. ELFMAR is a foundation that helps provide my education in terms of reading. And so I had learned about those programs. I'm a product of Reading Rainbow and Sesame Street, all those great nonprofit 501c3 philanthropic things. So I knew in my head that this victorious picture was going to be just fine. It was going to work for me. And I knew that's what I was going to get into. And so I started working. I started figuring out, oh my gosh, philanthropy, charity, nonprofit organization, it's hard. I had dug a very big picture for me. I thought it was easy. And I think that picture still resonates with a lot of people. And in fact, with that picture, I think a lot of nonprofit organizations, a lot of people that are interested in philanthropy and the big givers, they still have this picture available. They still think about this picture of philanthropy. And for those of us that have been in the field for a while, we know that this picture is a little bit different. We have changed over the last couple of years. Part of this is that we are being driven to have more metrics. Part of this is that we are being driven to have more investment in the numbers game. Colorado's an interesting place because we are a leader actually in a lot of philanthropic innovations. We have one, Denver for example, has the social impact bonds that are now going to help with their homeless projects. That's unique. Those aren't everywhere. Okay? We have microfinance projects that are happening across the southern Colorado that have been founded. We have a large number of folks that are giving a large amount of money here. We are a nonprofit mecca here in Colorado Springs, in the Pikes Peak region. We did a couple of studies with the Center for Nonprofit Excellence to try and capture what that economic impact is. We are an industry. And when I think back, when I first started learning about nonprofit organizations, no one talked to me about it as an industry. No one really talked about it in terms of GDP, how much economic value you have. No one talked about, well, what's the social return on investment? If I give you $1, how much more impact will that dollar have? What's my multiplier effect? And without getting into a class, because I'm a professor, that sometimes is what happens when we go down that rabbit hole, on the economics benefits of doing those types of calculations, we found that people were adopting these methods, and it put a lot of pressure on folks to sort of use those methods without really thinking about, well, how do we change our practices? How far do they pull us in a direction that's away from our mission? How far do they pull us away from the direction in terms of the relationships that we are building as fundraisers with our community members? How does this change our ability to tell the stories of the folks that we want to help? In short, the sector has a lot of pressure to become much more market-based, to try and figure out partnerships that are much more commercialized, and to look a lot more like other industries. Business, for example. We've absorbed a lot of those things. And some of the big name things like strategic philanthropy, high impact philanthropy, high engagement philanthropy, they're all asking us to adopt a large number of these high impact practices. So for example, for fundraisers, this means that some of you guys may have been asked to have a quota at the end of the week. How many people did you get to give this week? And so we have quota systems that are popping up in different places that people are trying this to sort of rev up and inspire people to fundraise. Or we are looking at metrics of fundraisers. So how many of your donors have you been able to move through that donation journey? And we might be able to incentivize you with bonuses, etc. And those are those micro practices that can create some difficulties. This summer, I was working with nonprofit evaluators trying to figure out how their jobs have changed. I'll be calling you guys next year to ask the same questions about how your job has changed as metrics start to pop up. For these guys, what came up was that we have a lot of pressures to do things that we never thought we were going to be doing. We have a lot of pressure to get away from our mission. We're not sure if what's happening is about our values. So these were some of the evaluators that are here. We have to do more with less. We have to look at the finances a bit more. And we're not sure what this is doing to us. There's not an anchor. And so what they asked for at the end of the project were a couple of anchors. Okay? And so part of this was trying to figure out, okay, how do you deal with the actual math of doing social impact analysis and all that other good stuff? And that's fine to talk about, but it doesn't get to some of the other issues that typically are happening with a lot of nonprofit organizations and with foundations who are trying to struggle with how do I fit into this high impact, high philanthropic trend. How do we look like them? What are we doing? Can we look like them? Should we look like them? So how do we have something that will gauge us into these, sort of put another anchor for us to hold on to? And so as we're thinking about these, something that kept popping up over and over again in some of the interviews that I was doing is that no one was talking about the ethics around the use of these metrics, the ethics around how it's changing our practices. And so a few years ago, a couple of my students and I started thinking about ethics in nonprofit organizations. One of the things that happens whenever one of my students comes through the door is that we're going to try to make sure that they don't experience what I experienced at 18, where all of the images were something that was so disconnected from actual practice. So everything that we do, we want to get into actual practice. So with the help of Daniel's fund, we have been doing some experiments, some pilot programs, trying to breathe life into this ethical toolbox that happened, that Heroes and Graphilos did a couple years ago. Breathe life into this sort of ethical lens. Because the things that we're talking about, the things that we're encountering, aren't necessarily going to be in the code of conduct. they're not going to go against your professional standards. Those are set in stone. They are the questions about, well, how do I engage with this particular metric? At what time do I use this multiplier effect? What's going to happen to it? When do I make those choices about the images that I am putting together for my brochures, etc.? Those many decisions. And to help people not feel so isolated, we wanted to have something as a conversational tool that would help people spur some interest, as well as something that would help them to remember some of these things. I know all of you know your code of ethics by heart and are able to say it at any given moment. I get that. But for those of us who don't have that type of memory, something like this tends to help a little bit. So here's what it is. It's 5 ethical lenses that people talk about, and on the left side you can see the first one is consequences. And for those of you guys that are Machiavellian in heart, I'm one of them, we're trying to figure out, does this actually get me where I want to go? If I do this action, if I make this decision, will I get what I need, right? Will this create the help? And it's not a bad place to start, but there's some ups and downs with that particular image. Sometimes we forget about how the journey that we're getting there, some of the mechanisms. So we move on to something that's a little bit different. On the opposite side, you're going to see something called deontology. All it means is that we're trying to figure out, can we be consistent? If this action is consistent with the things that we say we're supposed to do. Is it consistent with our professional norms? Is it consistent with our code of conduct? If we take this action, can we do it for all the people, or is this going to be an exception to the rule? And what are the consequences of that exception? We have down below virtue theory. And with virtue theory, it's basically this. We all have values for our organization. I won't ask you guys to call them out, but you all have values. If we take this action, does this actually make us do our values? Can we honestly say that this is part of the values that we have? And then my favorite one is intuition. Would my mama be proud? Or would she be a little angry? And if I'm not talking to her, I ask if my dad will be proud, right? But someone in your life that has that conscience to it, can we live with that decision the next day? Now those are the original 4 that Kuros and Garofalo talked about. My students started thinking about some others. And so one of the other lenses they added to the bucket is this idea of transformation. And this is the thing that usually is the sticky wicket when it comes to fundraising in particular. We know that we want our methods, our practices, to help us get the amount of dollars in. We know that we want to have the literature speak to people. We know that we want to have images that speak to folks. And so the question about is, are we being fair in our presentations? Okay? That's that idea of this transformation. By doing this action, which groups are empowered by this action and who's left out? Who are we concentrating on or who's not being highlighted? Because those are choices that we're making as we figure out which stories we're telling and which programs are being highlighted at a given time period, etc. So to help out with this, because again, images are powerful, my students and I come up with different ways of doing these things. Now, I am a Star Trek fan, right? And so when I was teaching them about this, I would use the Star Trek, and I would talk about each captain's abilities to do these types of things, that Captain Kirk is just interested in the means, Picard is interested in making sure that we're talking about those values, and half of them said, we don't watch Star Trek. No idea what you're talking about. But it was an aha moment for me. To get this sort of placemat outside of the academic head, we have to sort of think about how we can get it to you guys. And so the students said, look, we've got to create better placemats. And we have to help people think about that conversation of what that placemat can look like for our own individual organizations. And so this is the latest one from the last class that I did. They did it on movies. If you guys are House of Cards fans, that's what's up there. We've got Jimmy Cricket. We have Nelson Mandela, but again, there was some new movies that were coming out at that time period, and you can sort of see how those movies can help inform those images. But those images, again, are static to that group of students. So when we go out and we interact with a nonprofit organization, we either talk with board members or we talk with staff members to help them figure out this tool. We ask them, what's going to be your placemat? What are some of the images that you, as you are going to have these conversations about practice, having these conversations that help us feel a little bit less isolated, a little bit less disconnected from from the things that we are practicing, but also a little less disconnected from each other and what we do. What images can you put in your placemat? It could be movies. We've had some people who have done this and did it in terms of favorite leaders of their time period. We've had other people who went through their research on their organizations and put up images of folks who were really great philanthropists inside of their organizations, because you guys have stories about those organizations, how they worked, how they developed, etc. And they have images of people who really epitomize each one of those 5 lenses. And so they use those lenses to help reinforce their conversations that they're having when they make differences in terms of practice. So sometime today, maybe tomorrow, maybe during the breaks, try to figure out what your placemat might look like for you. What might be the conversation you can have inside of your organization about helping others and empowering them to make ethical decisions and deal with the pressures that we have with all of these new, innovative, sometimes faddish, sometimes a little bit annoying pressures to become more high impact, more high engagement, a little bit less who we are. Maybe you can find an anchor that will help to be a little bit more as you are.